Hey, how you doing? Oops, I'm on.
Testing, testing. I wonder if we have this in the hall, in the dining hall, if they can hear me. They can, if it's turned up. Problem. Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We're going to get started here. Today's a little unique. We're going to have three main teachings by our brother Eddie Chumney, and so the first one's at 10:30. And it's in your bulletin. It's entitled Why Yeshua is Called a Nazarene. And then at the main service, he'll do part one on the Nazarene influence on early Christianity. And then part two will be at 3 o'clock in here. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit unique. So, and I'm just going to make an announcement for everybody that's in the hallway or the dining hall or where you're not supposed to be. Either pick the young folks Torah portion in the room, or come into the main service, or if there's a children's class that you're attending, or if you're attending young children, you know, you do what you got to do, or if you got kitchen duties. But we'd like everybody in a designated spot because we're here to honor the King, not the speaker. We're here to honor our Messiah, and this is His day. I call it our Father's Day, and he wants us to come together as a body, as a community, to learn more about him so that we can be better neighbors, we can be better employees, employers, and and preparing people for the soon coming King. Okay? All right, so without further ado, Eddie, you want to come forward? He's from the HEBRAIC Heritage Ministries, and I think that started around 1991, 95. Okay, so Eddie.
Okay, so I'm on, right? All right. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Let me begin by saying it's a privilege, joy, and honor that Yeshua has given me to be able to be here again with you and to share with you a series of teachings which I started to study this winter. And so the first one is Yeshua and why was he called a Nazarene? It's based upon Matthew and chapter 2, verse 23. It says, "And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, he shall be called a Nazarene." Nowhere is there an explicit verse in the Hebrew Scriptures that says that the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. But it says that it might be fulfilled which is written by the prophet, he shall be called a Nazarene. So in what way was it prophesied that Yeshua was called a Nazarene? So this winter, I read about 15 or 20 books on the subject relating to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it has really expanded and revolutionized my understanding of Yeshua, the first century, and the New Testament writings. And so we have been studying the Hebrew roots of our faith in Messiah. But over the years, we have been taught and we learned the Christian side of things, that from what the faith originally was in the first century, as it went out into the non-Jewish world, it was Greco-Romanized. And so we have been taught how that has been so pretty thoroughly over the years. But what I realized after I did these studies on the Dead Sea Scrolls, that we are ignorant of understanding the roots of our faith on the Jewish side of things. We really don't have a good understanding of the Jewish roots of our faith in Messiah. So what do I mean by the Jewish roots of our faith in Messiah? I'm talking about who were the early Jews who became believers in Yeshua as the Messiah, and how and what caused them to be believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. So the historian Josephus says that there were three main sects in the first century, the second century BC. And the one sect is the Pharisees, the other sect is the Sadducees, and the third sect is whom we don't know that much about, which I'm going to try to help and illuminate regarding them, and that is who the historians call the Essenes. And so there's three main historians by which we get information in that era. The first is Josephus, and the second is Philo, and the third is Pliny the Elder. And all three of these historians refer to this group of people as the Essenes. However, in reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, they never refer to themselves as the Essenes. So I may refer to them as the Essenes just like the historians did, or I may refer to them as the Qumran community, or they called themselves by the Hebrew word Yahad. Yahad means togetherness, oneness, unity. So if I say the Yahad, the Qumran community, or the Essenes, I'm talking about the same group of people. So this community was headed by the sons of Zadok priests. And there's a verse in the New Testament that we're probably not familiar with, and it's in Acts chapter 6 and verse 7. It says, "The word of Elohim increased, and the number of disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith." There was a great number of priests who became believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. And this is recorded in Acts chapter 6. And so this is recorded before we're told about Stephen being stoned, before we're told about Paul's conversion. So this is very early after the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, that among the Jewish believers, there were many priests that became believers in Yeshua as Messiah. So who are these priests? Are they Pharisees? Are they Sadducees? Or did they come from the people which the historians called the Essenes? So I'd like to submit to you they came from the people which historians called the Essenes. They were the leaders of the Essene community. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in multiple places, it tells us that the leaders of the Qumran, the leaders of the Essenes, they referred to themselves as the sons of Zadok. They were the Zadok priests that were descended from Zadok, the priest, that was in the days of David and Solomon. So let me answer the question up front as to why Yeshua was called a Nazarene. It is because the things that he taught and the things that he did to someone trying to observe and put a label on him. You know how, like, really to the extended outside world, they may say you and I are Christians. But in the Christian world, they might want to know, well, what denomination do you identify with? And so by the way that you practice your faith, you may be identified with a certain kind of denomination. So you are given that label of what they perceive you to be. And so the same was done with Yeshua. Even though he said, my doctrine comes from my Father. In other words, he didn't belong to any particular group. He didn't belong to the Pharisees. He didn't belong to the Sadducees. He didn't belong to the Essenes. What he taught, what he did was strictly came from his Father, as he said in the book of John. Nevertheless, the things that he did in following the Torah of his heavenly Father, the things that he did was most identified with the Essene sect, the Essene community. And so there's a question as to what's the meaning of the word Essene. So it's believed that the word Essene basically means holy ones, because they lived a very strict religious lifestyle. So the historians called those that lived a strict religious lifestyle, they called them holy ones, or the word would be Essenes. And so there were Essenes who became believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. There were Essenes that did not. And so since before we had believers in Yeshua as the Messiah, we had Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. What happened when there were Jews that ended up believing in Yeshua as the Messiah? Now, were there Pharisees that believed that Yeshua as the Messiah? Yeah. The New Testament actually tells us that there were Pharisees that became believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. Were there Sadducees? I'm sure that there were, but I'm not familiar with the New Testament telling us that specifically any Sadducees believed, but I'm sure that there were some. But we are told that there are Pharisees that became believers, but the majority of the early Jewish believers in Yeshua were Essenes. And so, therefore, what were the believers in Yeshua? How did they get labeled, these early Jewish believers? Well, they were seen as a branch of the Essenes. So the Hebrew word for branch is Nazar. And so Nazarene, the root of Nazarene, is the Hebrew word Nazar, which means a branch. So initially, they were just called the branches. The word Nazarene. Now, the early believers in Yeshua, as is recorded in the book of Acts, are not only called Nazarenes, but they're called the people of the way. So in order to understand why they were called the people of the way, you have to understand the history of how those who were living in the Qumran, the Dead Sea area, how they were formed. And so how they were formed is that from the days of David and Solomon, the faithful priest that was with David and thus was the priest beginning with the days of Solomon was Zadok. So the Torah says that the high priest are to be from the sons of Aaron. So Zadok is a son of Aaron through his son Eleazar. And so then from the days of Zadok the priest and the days of David and Solomon, all the high priests of Israel were Zadok priests until about 175 BC in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And I'm sure you're familiar with Antiochus Epiphanes IV because he's the figure that we talk about when we talk about Hanukkah and what Hanukkah is about. So Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he wanted to bring in Greek ways to the land of Judea, the land of Israel, and have the Jews follow and take upon themselves Greek ways. So they ultimately influenced the high priesthood. And as a result of influencing the high priesthood, it was seen by the Zadok priest that ultimately the temple in its system had become corrupted. And so in it being corrupted from Greek influence, they saw and they looked in the scriptures as to what they thought they should do. They believed, based upon the things that was going on around them in their world, they believed that they were living in the end of days. So there were two scriptures that influenced them in their behavior and their action. And so the first one comes from Amos in chapter 5 and verse 27, where it talks about the captivity in the land of Damascus. And so as a result of and from the influence of that verse, there was a nickname for the Essene community that lived in the Qumran, and the nickname for their community was the land of Damascus. So we're not talking about Damascus, Syria. It was a nickname for their community based upon Amos chapter 5 and verse 27. So the other verse by which they saw as Yah's direction for the situation was Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3. So Isaiah chapter 40 verse 3 says, "The voice of him that cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of Yahweh, and make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Hey, Mike, is it possible for me to get a sip of water? So prepare ye the way of Yahweh. And so they were formed based upon this verse. And because everyone knew that they were formed based upon this verse, that's why they were called the people of the way. And so that's the background of the history of who they were and how they were formed. So in essence, in the first century, we have two primary sects of the Jews, two primary. One is the Essenes, and the other is the Pharisees. So a great number of the Essene community is what the book of Acts is referring to when it says, I believe it says there were, in Acts chapter 21, in verse 20, it says, "When they heard it, they glorified Yahweh and said, 'You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they're all zealous for the Torah.'" So who are these thousands of Jews that believe? Well, by and large, they were of the Essene community. So the Essene community and the priests that became believers in Yeshua as the Messiah. Now, what caused them to believe in Yeshua as the Messiah? It is because their belief system, which is written in the scrolls, their belief system was very close to what Yeshua was teaching and what Yeshua was doing. And so because their belief system was so close to him and what he was saying and what he was doing, it was very easy for them to say, oh, he's the Messiah. Wherein the belief system of the Pharisees made it difficult for them as a group to believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. So what happened to the Essenes that became believers in Yeshua as the Messiah? They are who we read about in the book of Acts in early Christianity. And much of their doctrinal belief is the doctrinal belief that we understand today in what we call Christianity, as we read and believe it in the New Testament. Now, the belief that there's an age of law and there's an age of grace, and the age of grace supersedes the age of law, that came from the Greco-Romans when the faith left its roots, that is, the early Jewish believers in Yeshua. Because the Qumran community, when it got established, they saw themselves and they referred to themselves as a covenant community. And because of the corruption that was going on in Jerusalem, the temple system, which they fled, they referred to themselves and they saw themselves as making a new covenant. So all those that joined their community, they did so in making a new covenant. Now, in order to join their community, you had to go through a 2 or 3 year process. You had to be evaluated to make sure you were sincere and you were going to follow the beliefs of the community. So they required that you had to first repent of your sin and then accept the new covenant. And then once you accepted the new covenant, then you affirmed your acceptance into the community by being baptized, by being immersed. Okay, so we know how the Pharisees viewed you join their community because it's recorded in Acts chapter 15. And it's still the same thing today. In order to join their community, you had to convert. And for a male, conversion means you had to go through a physical circumcision. Okay, so that's how you join the community of the Pharisees. The Essenes did not require that. It was repenting of your sins, and then you had to be sincere in your heart. You joined the new covenant community, and you had to agree to follow the Torah. And follow the Torah as the Hebrew scriptures tell you're supposed to follow the Torah under the leadership of the Zadok priesthood. So I'm probably going to run out of time here in this session. So I'm going to continue wherever I leave off here in the main session to sharing with you what the Essene community believed and how that aided them in believing in Yeshua as the Messiah, and how ultimately then those who believed in Yeshua and Yeshua himself became identified with the branches of the Essenes that believed in him, called Nazarenes. All right? So that is what I want to cover in this session. I'm going to continue in the main session. And then following completing this particular topic, then I'm going to show you from what's going on with John the Baptist, with the Apostle John, with Paul, and how a lot of the belief of the Essene community is in the writings of the New Testament. I'm going to show you how that is so. So that's what I'm going to be covering today in the sessions. So let's see if I can get this thing to work. So do I hit the, is it on?
I have a question for you, Eddie.
Yeah.
When they said that they followed Yeshua as their Messiah, were there not several Messiahs that Jewish believers followed or could have followed?
Well, there was a question, and this appears in Matthew chapter 11. So the question is, were there several messiahs that the Jews could have followed? So the Jews in the day had a question of whether there's going to be one Messiah or whether there's going to be multiple messiahs that fulfill different roles. So the same was in the Essene community. Okay, so they believed that there was going to be a Messiah that came through the line of David, but they also was expecting a priestly Messiah. Okay, so because they were expecting a priestly Messiah and a Messiah that would come through the line of David, this is the reason why John asks his question of Yeshua in Matthew in chapter 11. It says in verse 2, "Now when John had heard in prison the works of Messiah, he sent two of his disciples and said, 'Are you he that should come, or do we look for another?'" In other words, is there one Messiah or is there two Messiahs? And so Yeshua says, "Go show John these things you do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." So that's the answer to his question. Now to you and I, Yeshua, we probably think he didn't clearly answer the question. But to John, he answered the question. So the answer that he gave to John is a combination of several scriptures, okay? So in Psalm 146, Psalm 146, in verse 8, it says, "Yahweh opens the eyes of the blind, he raises them that are bowed down, and he loves the righteous." Verse 7, "He executes mishpat for the oppressed, he gives food to the hungry, and he looses the prisoners." So these verses in Psalm 146, verse 7 and 8, and then in Isaiah chapter 61, Isaiah chapter 61, it says, "The Spirit of Yahweh Elohim is upon me, because Yahweh has appointed me to preach good tidings to the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of prison to them that are bound." All right, so Psalm 146, 7 and 8, and Isaiah 61, verse 1, is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls as an expectation for the coming of the Messiah and who the Messiah would be and what the Messiah would do. But in looking at Psalm 146, verses 7 and 8, and Isaiah chapter 61, comparing to Yeshua's answer in Matthew chapter 11, verse 5, there's something in Yeshua's answer in Matthew 11, verse 5 that's not in Psalm 146, verse 7 and 8, and not in Isaiah 61, and that is the dead are raised. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in referencing Psalm 146 and Isaiah 61, and the expectation of what the Messiah would do, it is stated in the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Messiah will raise the dead. And so there's a strong belief and a tremendous amount of evidence that John the Baptist was raised in the Qumran community. And that being the case, he would have known, of course, what the Qumran community believed and what the Qumran community expected about the Messiah. So basically, Yeshua's answer to him told John clearly, yes, I am the Messiah. Now, his answer also is a hint as well to Ezekiel in chapter 35. So in Ezekiel in chapter 35, I'm sorry, I said Ezekiel chapter 35. I meant Isaiah chapter 35. Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. Once again, Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then the lame man shall leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. And so Yeshua also can be hinting at Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. But in Isaiah 35, verse 10, it says, "And the ransom of Yahweh shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy." That's ending the exile. And who is supposed to end the exile is King Messiah. So I said all this to say this. Yeshua was saying he was the Messiah to John. And John understood his answer. All right. So we won't be able to get very far in the teaching, but no problem. We'll continue it at the main session, but we're going to see how far we can get. So one of my sources that I used, I'm getting this information I'm going to begin to share with you, is from this book called Yeshua, He Will Be Called a Nazarene by Dr. Robert Schreiner. And I'm on this slide reading from page 59. And so he's referring to Matthew chapter 2, verse 23, that says Yeshua will be called a Nazarene. So Matthew 2:23 is a critical text for the purposes of this work. It is a verse concerning which there is nearly unanimous agreement among the commentators regarding the significance of the expression, "He will be called a Nazarene." The usual interpretation regarding the significance of the expression, "He will be called a Nazarene," the usual interpretation is that Yeshua, though born in Bethlehem, was raised from childhood in Nazareth of Galilee, and for that reason, he was called a Nazarene. Nazareth was his hometown. His followers were known as Nazarenes because they were disciples of the man from Nazareth. Nazarene is understood to be a label of a resident from Nazareth. So this is the typical explanation in understanding. And so the Strong's number, the Greek Strong's number 3480 states regarding this Greek word for Nazarene, referring to an inhabitant of Nazareth, by extension a Christian. There are, however, problems with this understanding. First, Nazarene is not the name used for a resident of Nazareth in either Greek or Hebrew. In Hebrew, the term is Nazrati. The Greek translation or transliteration would be something like, and it gives you the Greek, and I can't read Greek. You probably can't either. So it's all Greek to us. So these Greek renderings retain the T or the TH, the Greek transliteration, which is the last letter of the name of the town of Nazareth. This rendering is also in keeping with Greek translations or transliterations of references to residents of other towns in Israel, which have as their last letter a T. For example, the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the standard Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament is what the Septuagint is, renders the Hebrew name of the town of Gath, ends in TH, in the following way. And so when you put it into the Greek, it retains that TH ending. So this is very technical. To basically, we're going to end up seeing from the explanation that instead of always meaning Nazareth, from the town of Nazareth, that it's going to refer to him being a Nazarene. Okay? So if Nazarene is not a Greek translation or a transliteration for a resident of Nazareth, what is it? In Acts chapter 24, verse 5, the Apostle Paul is about to offer a defense of his faith before the Roman governor Felix. Paul's accuser, one Tertullus, describes Paul as a leader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So if we take the Greek for Nazarenes, the same Greek word that Matthew uses in Matthew 2:23 to describe Yeshua. So the author of the book asserts that Matthew did not use the term Nazarene to identify Yeshua as a resident of Nazareth, but as a person associated with the sect of the Nazarenes. So here I have from the Blue Letter Bible, for some reason it's overlapping, but that's okay. So I was showing you, it's the Strong's Greek number 3480 from Acts 24, verse 5. It's the same Strong's number of Matthew chapter 2, verse 23. So Matthew 2:23, in this should be rendered the same way. And so the point is being made that it's speaking about Yeshua being identified with the sect of the Nazarenes. There's another problem with the view that Matthew uses the term Nazarene to describe Yeshua as a resident of Nazareth. The problem is that Matthew asserts that Yeshua was called a Nazarene in fulfillment of that which was spoken of by the prophets. However, the town of Nazareth is nowhere mentioned in the Old Testament prophecy or the entire Old Testament for that matter. Neither does the term Nazarene appear in the pages of the Old Testament, not in that literal way. But there is a solution to this issue. So let's take, for example, Isaiah 11, verse 1. It says, "A shoot will come out of the stock of Jesse, and a branch out of his roots will bear fruit." The Hebrew word for branch is a word that shares the same three-letter root, netzer, which is the name of the city of Nazareth, and the sect that bore the name Nazarenes. And so there's a couple ways to look at the meaning of he will be called a Nazarene. That he is a branch from Jesse, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, which is in the prophets. And also a dual meaning that he's a branch of the Essenes that believed in him. He's identified with the branch of the Essenes that believed in him. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls in 4Q 161, they, of course, see Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1, that a branch will grow out of the root of Jesse as referring to a future Messiah. So now from Yair Davidi's book, Ephraim, the Gentile Children of Israel, he gives us a little Hebrew lesson. The root, N, T, Z, and R, the Nun, the Zadi, and the Resh, the root letters of Nazar, is that from which the word Notzri, meaning Christian, is derived, allegedly associated with the town of Nazareth, which is considered the hometown of Yeshua. So the way that you would say Christian in Israel is Notzri. It's how you would say Christian using Hebrew in Israel today. So Notzri comes from the Hebrew word Natsar, which means a branch. So even today, the word Christian in the Hebrew language is associated with branch. And so Don Isaac Abarbanel, rabbi from 1437 to 1538, suggests that when you see the word Notzrim in the Hebrew scriptures, it's going to be a reference to what would be called a Christian today. Another issue that deserves consideration is whether Matthew's identification of Isaiah's Nazar is a reference to Yeshua as an individual who was the Messiah, or to Yeshua as an individual associated with the sect of the Nazarenes. I believe that if Matthew was pointing to Yeshua as the Messiah, he would not have used the indefinite term a Nazarene, but rather would included the definite article the Nazarene, that is, the one and only Nazarene and Messiah. The fact that he uses the indefinite a Nazarene communicates that Yeshua was one of many individuals who were, at the time of Matthew's writing, associated or linked with the sect of the Nazarenes. So here we have in Acts chapter 24, verse 5, this is Paul, and it is said of him that he's a leader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So Acts chapter 24, verse 5 definitely refers to the Greek word as referring to the sect. And so now I'm going to give you some examples. It goes to a technical explanation for those that know Greek, and I am really not a Greek expert by any means. But in Matthew chapter 21, verse 11, it says, this is the prophet Yeshua from Nazareth of Galilee. So breaking down the Greek, what's being said here is that in this verse, it is referring to Yeshua being from the town of Nazareth, okay? And another example, Mark 1:9, in those days Yeshua came from Nazareth. So in breaking down the Greek, once again, this is an example of the text referring that he's from the town of Nazareth. However, from Matthew 26, verse 71, Yeshua is linked with the sect of the Nazarenes. It says, when he had gone out onto the porch, someone else saw him and said to those who were there, this man was with Yeshua, and it's translated of Nazareth. But in looking at the Greek, it says, here the reference is to the sect of the Nazarenes. That is because the Greek term, it's got the Greek there, that to is the Greek definite article, the in the genitive case. Genitives are relational, often being translated by the English term of, the, or one belonging to. And so the other Greek word is a Greek noun, naturally matching the definite article in the genitive case. So it's all technical stuff that you may not be able to follow or understand. But basically the point is that the Greek should be rendering that it's referring to Yeshua as a Nazarene in this verse, not necessarily from the town of Nazareth. So, in Mark chapter 16, verse 6, it says, he said to them, don't be amazed, you seek Yeshua, the Nazarene. And in the American Standard Version, Mark 16:6, is translated as Yeshua, the Nazarene, identifying with the sect of the Nazarene, and not referring to from the town of Nazareth. So in John 19, verse 19, that was written on the cross, Yeshua of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And so putting this into the Greek, once again, that phrase would be identifying him with the Nazarenes. And another example, Acts chapter 22, verse 8, where in this particular translation that is in the book, it says, I am Yeshua of Nazareth, whom you persecute. But in the Young's literal translation, it says, I am Yeshua the Nazarene, whom you persecute. So this is all a long technical stuff, only to make the following point. Instead of the word Nazarene being exclusively a reference to the town of Nazareth when referring to Yeshua, there are instances where that is the case. But there's also other instances in the text where the phrase Yeshua, that the phrase is going to link him with being a Nazarene. All right? That's the whole technical point of what I'm trying to show you in these examples, so that you may not think I'm just making up that understanding or that interpretation, okay? So the Jewish historian Josephus, oh my time's up. It's 11:15. All right, that's a good stop. Huh? I got what? How much longer so I can quit on time? 6 minutes. All right, so the Jewish historian Josephus mentions that there were two branches of the Essenes. The Christian father, Epiphanius, mentions the Essenes or the Nazarenes, and most of what he said, comes from the 4th century. He wrote in Panarion 29 verse 6, he states that the Nazarene sect before the time of Yeshua, before Messiah, did not know Messiah. So there was a certain point of time that the Nazarenes didn't believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, but then there came a point in time where they did believe that he is the Messiah. And so this quote-unquote Christian father of the 4th century, he then said that there were two branches of the Essenes. And so that's why one branch that believed in Yeshua, that branch was called a branch. The branch that believed in Yeshua, Nazarene. However, the Essenes may have had several sects, not just necessarily two. And this comes from Hippolytus of Rome in his refutation of all heresies, refuting all heresies. So now, instead of seeing and understanding that the Essenes was just this Qumran community, they actually lived in communities throughout the land of Israel. And so you might say, well, what happened to them? Well, they got diminished from history. And who diminished them was Greco-Roman Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. And so that's why we lost connection 2,000 years later to being aware of them, because in history they got diminished. So as the faith went out into the non-Jewish world, and what happened, there was a final Jewish revolt in about 135 AD. Bar Kokhba was proclaimed the Messiah by Rabbi Akiva, and the Romans put down that revolt. And following that revolt, the Romans said Jews are not allowed to come into Jerusalem. And the first 15 bishops of Jerusalem were Jewish. But then the Romans said, the Jews are not allowed to come into Jerusalem. And that began a process, among other things, for the non-Jewish believers in Yeshua to distance themselves from what they regarded as things Jewish. And the thing that was identified as Jewish, of course, was Sabbath, festivals, dietary laws. So they began distancing themselves from that in the roots of the early Jewish believers who did keep the Sabbath and the festivals in the dietary laws. And so the Greco-Roman world then came up with, oh, he died to do away with the Torah, and ultimately became, from the Roman Catholic Church into modern Protestantism, the doctrine of dispensationalism, age of law, age of grace. So we lost the Jewish roots of our faith and the Jewish influence. Then Rabbinic Judaism, they didn't believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, and so they just didn't talk about this other sect in their writings. So we can't necessarily go to their writings. So both groups diminished from history. The sect of the Jews, the Essenes, that became called Nazarenes, or the people of the way, that ended up believing in Yeshua as the Messiah. And so therefore we even lost the connection of their influence in the New Testament writings. So Yeshua then is linked with the Qumran community. So what happened from the time of the prophets to the New Testament? Excuse me. So the author of this book, The Sons of Light, by David Gaston writes, I'm truly thankful for my Christian upbringing, glad to have been brought up to read the wonderful and varied collection of Jewish literature we know as the Old Testament, and consequently to appreciate the Jewish foundations of Christianity. However, I have been taught that there was a great silence in the years between the completion of the Protestant Old Testament and the birth of Messiah. I now find that position to have been challenged beyond breaking point. That's what I was told too. From Malachi to the New Testament was 400 silent years. Well, the reason is because ultimately, who influenced the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures were the Pharisees. And to give you a good, fast, simple understanding of the difference between the Essenes and the Pharisees, the Essenes were the Jewish Pentecostals, and the Pharisees are the Jewish Baptists. Now, if you know anything about Baptist doctrine today, the Baptists say the signs, wonders, miracles, dreams, visions, prophets, that all ended with the apostolic age. What they called the apostolic age, and it's not for today. And so the Pharisees had the same doctrine. Prophets, prophecies, Yah's ongoing revelation to his people. It stopped with Malachi. In other words, it wasn't happening in the 2nd century BC. It wasn't happening in the 1st century BC. And with that being the case, my time is up. So we're going to take our break, and I'll continue with the main session.
Okay, so we'll take a break. We'll be back here at 11:30 to start the main service. Thank you.